I'm like a bit more loops and vibes guy than lines. I'm assuming you are a much more vibes guy, a bit of loops and less lines. Just meeting
Sounds about
you.
right. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you start seeing people around you and say, hey, that person is a bit more lines, loops, vibes, right? We get that. Then you start seeing that the teams are also lines, loops, vibes.
Derek here for Civic Punks, and I am super excited to be joined here today by Suhit, who I met in Australia like 2 weeks ago. It's
2 weeks,
kind of
maybe.
wild to
Yeah,
think
yeah,
about.
just about 2 weeks. Yeah.
We were at the Open Fisca conference, and you did a presentation on framework model. I'm not sure what we call it.
Yeah.
That I thought was really compelling. So I really wanted to sort of get you on camera and record this conversation with you about this whole idea of vibes, loops, and lines. But before you get into that, why don't I give you a chance to sort of introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Derek. Good to catch up and chat again. So I'm Suhit. I live in Adelaide, Australia. I run the Helix Lab. For 20 plus years, I've done strategy and design. And now it's all about co-intelligence for me. How does strategy and design show up in the AI world? And I believe it's all about co-intelligence. So what I do is I work with organizations around how do we reimagine ourselves for the AI native world. I work with governments, federal, local, state, but I also work with private enterprise and not-for-profits.
But let's dig into the key thing, which I'm super excited to dive into
Yes.
with, which is this idea of vibes, loops, and lines. What are vibes, loops, and lines?
Yeah, so I was going deep into trying to combine my 20 plus years of strategy and design with AI. And so last year I published this book, The Helix Movement. So the Helix Movement is basically this idea about how, if you look at the helix, the strategy, design, and AI comes together as a helix. But as I was writing the book, I realized that we've tried to always put ourselves into these boxes, right? You are structured, or if you take project management language, you're waterfall or you're agile, or your futures thinking, and you are all guts. I then realized that actually there's no one right answer, and actually they are just rhythms, and I started naming them. And then that's how it became lines, loops, and vibes. From a visualization, lines are triangles. So they're not like lines, they're actually triangles because it's all about structure. Loops are, of course, circle, and vibes are just waves. And that kind of gave me like a new language, I would say. And my entire book about strategy and then design followed this. And then I started to see that strategy and policy, and I've seen that for a long time, is actually very similar in terms of the challenges and approaches. And just as a quick history, 100 years back, policy was policy and strategy. There was no strategy. Strategy was all military. So there was literally only policy. And we've kind of separated out strategy and policy over the last 50, 60 years, but it's actually the same thing at the core of it. And so the whole idea behind lines, loops, and vibes is that these are rhythms that if I tell you, Derek, you'll straight away get it because like you see it, just that we've never named it. But what is super interesting I found was, as a human, I'm like a bit more loops and vibes guy than lines. I'm assuming you are a much more vibes guy, a bit of loops and less lines, just meeting
Sounds about
you.
right.
Yeah. And then you start seeing people around you and say, hey, that person is a bit more lines, loops, vibes, right? We get that. Then you start seeing that the teams are also lines, loops, vibes. You start saying, hey, a finance team can be a bit more lines. That makes sense. A marketing team is a bit more vibes. That makes sense. A policy team in government is generally very analytical. So there's a bit more lines and less loops. And then you start seeing those things and saying, oh, that's interesting. And then you go up the ladder and say, the organizations itself are lines, loops, vibes. Some are more lines and loops. And I'll give you a good example. Google and Apple both do sales and marketing. But Google is a very data-driven marketing engine. So very loopy, actually, because they do a lot of experimentation and testing before they go out. And Apple is a very vibes, just their marketing, their language, their approach. So even though they are like same kind of working approaches of sales and marketing, they're actually done very differently because it's culturally very different. And then finally, you look at the market and saying, what is this problem we are solving? And what kind of rhythm does this require? And this goes to the heart of the policy and strategy challenge. And so as I started to layer all of this, Derek, I started to see that LLV or lines, loops, vibes has so many layers that you can peel off and actually is extremely valuable. Then saying traditional ways, oh, you guys are not adaptive, or you need to change, or this is the wrong thing. It's actually like match the rhythm to the challenge, match the right rhythm to the problem, and figure out how we make the rhythm happen.
So I love the language. So just to peel it back just to make sure I understand and my assumptions are correct. Lines are much more linear, they're much more structured, stable. Loops is this whole idea of iteration and continually learning and adapting. And
Yep.
then vibes is where you don't really have an idea of what's going on, but you're going by your intuition, your gut in response to things. Is that a
It,
fair assessment of those three?
almost fair, but not. And the
Okay.
reason is because maybe the best way to explain is the old Donald Rumsfeld, stuff, right? So lines are known knowns,
Mhm.
loops are known unknowns, and vibes are unknown unknowns. And it's very important because it's not just gut, and gut is a starting point, but it could be weak signals, it could be futures, it could be scenarios, it could be sensing. Like if you start pulling up the layers, sensing and weak signals is actually a legitimate way of seeing the world. There's a whole bunch of people who specialize in that job. We have
Yeah.
got futurists and companies who bet on the future actually understand these weak signals better than others. So vibes is actually very powerful. But the challenge is vibes on its own is not useful. You have to convert vibes into something valuable. That's where loops come in. And that's where you need adaptive experimentation, iterations, and all of that. Then finally, lines are very useful because if you don't have a line, then all your vibes and loops are just kind of looping and vibing, and there's no structure to create value. So lines are actually extremely valuable. So each has its strengths and each has its weakness. And if you stay in one place for too long, you actually have a larger challenge.
I like that. So, okay, I want to dig into this in particular, how this relates to government.
Yes.
I think a good place to start is with policy. One of the questions I have for you with this is when I think about policy and how it usually plays out in a government context, it's very line like.
Hmm.
You go through this process, you create a policy, and then it's locked in. There's not a lot of movement. In fact, this whole idea of agile policymaking, taking a loops approach to policymaking, is a newer concept that government's still trying to wrap their head around, let alone, like, we're not even close to vibes yet. Does that make sense as a way of looking at policy and government? How does your lines, loops, and vibes tie into policy for you?
Yeah, sure. Great point. Having worked inside government at the highest levels and outside, I've seen it in multiple ways. I actually think there's some very interesting angles here. I think a lot of policy is not just lines. I actually
Mm,
think a lot of policy is vibes. And I'll tell you why. Because, politicians, bureaucrats, they sense something. You see all these policies being announced. There's actually a lot of vibes based policy without too much lines, I would say. The
oh,
lines come
interesting.
later. Not all policies, but when something comes very quickly, when there's a crisis or when an idea comes up in somebody's mind, it's actually a very weak signal. It's a vibe based thing, and generally that goes to lines. The issue is not vibes or lines. The issue is actually there's a big loops missing. Nobody has figured out why is this vibe that I get, this weak signal, this sense, this understanding of the community or the sense of where the world is going is important. And how do I make sure that's the real thing before we make it a line? And so from the vibe to line, there is a loops missing. And this is like a different angle to the same conversation you just said, because everybody goes from lines to this and say we don't have enough adaptive policy, which is true, absolutely. And the whole point of the policy playbook we wrote is policy as a journey, which is actually saying that adaptive policy is super critical. But it's also important that we understand why loops is missing from two angles. From the lines angle, which is very obvious to the people who listen to this or understand this. But I want to emphasize that there's a vibes angle that's missing too, because I've seen a lot of policy making where people don't question the initial hypothesis or the sense making, and we don't try it enough to take it to the lines, and we go to lines very quickly. So I think from both angles, I think it's super important to understand it, and which kind of interestingly comes back to the same logic that loops are missing. It's just that from both the angles, the loops are missing for me.
I think I like that. And I think part of it for me is that we really haven't had the tools and the technology to enable effective loop
Mm,
approaches to policy,
mm,
right? And this is what, I mean, going back to the conference, this is what the whole idea of digital twins unlocks for us. Because all of a sudden, if you have a digital twin, you can take your vibes, your hunches, and you can throw a test into a digital twin and then just run it and see, like,
correct.
does this work? Does this not work? And you can run it from different angles. And that starts to get you the loops that you can then iterate on before you move it to the line section. Amazing. Well, thank you for making the time. I really appreciate it. And looking forward to when can people, what do you have a timeline for the book?
Doing is I'm going to launch it on my website, suhitanantula.com, starting next week as a
Okay.
weekly serial.
Soon. Oh my gosh. Okay. Okay. You're serializing it. So it's going to come as a
It's coming as a serial. It's going to be free. Then you can download as a PDF when it's ready. I'm going to make it easy for the agents to read it as much as the humans. And my goal is that I want feedback. I want people to tell me what it's going. Hopefully, Derek, we learn enough that the co-intelligent organization is then redone for the co-intelligent government, which is my
Mm.
next goal. But this is written a bit more like is so cutting edge. I don't have enough examples. There's a bit of government examples. It's everybody, business, government, not for profits, but mostly business. But yeah, it's so good timing that you ask. It's just coming next week. It's serialized. It's on my website, so it's free.
But I mean, that gives me a real incentive to make sure I edit this video and post it really quickly. Amazing. Suhit, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate making time. And I'm super excited to dig into the book as it comes out. So I'll
No,
be one of
thank
the
you,
first
Derek.
people.
This has been a great conversation. You've given me a chance to express all these different ideas very respectfully and giving me the space to think through. So I appreciate that.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And take care. Have a good beginning of your day.
Yes, thank you. And you, and end of the day.
Take care.
Cheers, mate.